I never imagined the night before Christmas would be the night everything I believed shattered. That cold Christmas Eve, while the city lights of Chicago flickered outside our window like tiny, hopeful stars, I secretly installed a hidden camera in our son's room. What I saw next broke me in ways I never thought possible. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Robert, and I'm 63 years old. I spent 35 years of my life believing I was building something beautiful with the woman I loved. I thought we were partners, building a future together in this sprawling city of Chicago, where the wind cuts through you in winter and the summers feel like hope itself. But sometimes, the people closest to us are the ones who hurt us the most. That December morning started like any other. The smell of burnt coffee filled our cramped kitchen on Chicago's South Side. I'd been up since 5 trying to prepare everything for Christmas Eve. The walls of our small apartment were lined with photographs from better times. There was Sarah, my wife, laughing as she held our newborn son, Michael, 22 years ago. There I was, younger, hopeful, my arm around her waist as we stood in front of our first apartment together. But those photographs felt like accusations now. They reminded me of promises broken, of dreams that had curdled into something bitter and cold. I remember folding my worn flannel shirt that morning, the same one I'd been wearing for 3 years because Sarah always needed money for her art supplies, her classes, her projects that never seemed to end. My hands shook as I buttoned it. At 63, I shouldn't have been afraid in my own home, but I was. The silence in our apartment was the kind that swallows you whole. Sarah hadn't spoken to me in 3 days, not since I'd asked her to help me wrap Michael's Christmas presents. She'd looked at me with those cold blue eyes and said, "Can't you see I'm busy?" Then she'd locked herself in what used to be our guest room, which had become her art studio years ago. Michael, our 22-year-old son, still lived with us. He'd graduated from community college but couldn't find steady work. I didn't mind. I loved having him home. But lately, I'd noticed something troubling. He'd become distant, confused, spending hours in his room with the door locked. When I knocked, he'd say he was fine, but his voice sounded hollow, empty. I worked double shifts at Romano's Deli on Western Avenue, slicing meat for 12 hours a day, my back aching, my feet swollen in those cheap work shoes I couldn't afford to replace. Every dollar I earned went into our household account. Sarah had access to everything. I trusted her completely. I thought that's what marriage meant. But trust, I learned, can be the most dangerous thing you give someone. That morning, as I prepared to leave for work, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was coming from Michael's room. Not crying exactly, but a sound I'd never heard from my son before. A whimpering, like a wounded animal. I knocked gently. "Michael? Son, are you okay?" Silence. "Michael, it's Dad. Please, talk to me." The door opened slowly. My son stood there, and what I saw broke my heart. His face was pale, drawn, exhausted. His room behind him was in chaos. Drawings scattered on the floor, art supplies everywhere, but not his art supplies. Sarah's. "Dad," he whispered, "I need to tell you something, but I'm scared." I stepped into his room, and that's when I saw them. On his walls, where his childhood drawings used to hang, where his certificates from school had been displayed with pride, there were new paintings, dark, twisted images that made no sense, abstract shapes in black and deep red that seemed to move in the dim light. They were signed with Sarah's initials. "She said they were better than my drawings," Michael said quietly. "She said mine were childish, embarrassing. She painted over them while I was sleeping." I felt something crack inside my chest. These weren't just drawings. These were memories. Michael's first attempts at art when he was 7 years old, his Mother's Day card from 3rd grade, his high school graduation portrait that he'd drawn himself, all of it painted over, erased, as if his childhood, his joy, his innocence had never existed. "When did this happen?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "It's been going on for months, Dad. Every night after you go to work your evening shift, she comes in here. She says she's improving my space, making it more sophisticated. But Dad, I loved my drawings. They reminded me of being happy." I looked at my son, really looked at him, and I saw what I'd been too blind to notice. He wasn't just tired. He was disappearing. The light that had always shone in his eyes since he was a baby was fading. "Have you told her how this makes you feel?" Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She says I'm ungrateful, that she's a real artist and I should be honored she's sharing her space with me. She says you don't understand art, that you're just a deli worker who smells like salami." The words hit me like physical blows. Not just the insult to me, but the cruelty to our son. This was the woman I'd worked 3 jobs to put through art school. The woman I'd believed in when no one else would. I'm scared to sleep in here now, Dad, Michael continued. Sometimes I wake up and she's standing over my bed just staring at me. She whispers things about how I'm wasting my potential, how I'm disappointing her. That afternoon, I made a decision that would change everything. I drove to an electronics store on North Michigan Avenue, using money I'd been saving for months to buy Sarah a special Christmas gift. Instead, I bought a small hidden camera. I felt like a criminal. What kind of husband spies on his own wife? But something dark was happening in our home, and I needed to know the truth. Christmas Eve arrived with a bitter wind that rattled our windows. Snow fell steadily, covering Chicago in a blanket that should have felt magical, but only felt cold and unforgiving. I installed the camera in Michael's room while Sarah was out buying last-minute supplies for her latest art project. That evening, I pretended to be asleep early, claiming exhaustion from the holiday rush at the deli. But I was wide awake, watching the live feed on my phone from the hallway outside our bedroom. At first, nothing happened. Then, around midnight, I saw Sarah enter Michael's room. What I witnessed over the next hour destroyed everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd loved for 25 years. She didn't just paint over his artwork. She tormented him. She stood over his bed as he slept, whispering cruel things about his appearance, his intelligence, his future. She told him he was worthless, that he'd never amount to anything, that he was a burden on our family. I watched her take his Christmas presents, the ones I'd carefully wrapped and hidden in his closet, and throw them in the trash. She replaced them with art books and supplies, but not as gifts, as assignments, as punishment for being, in her words, artistically inferior. But the worst part, the part that made me drop my phone and rush to the bathroom to vomit, was when she took out a small notebook and began reading from it. It was a list, a detailed record of every cruel thing she could do to break our son's spirit, to make him completely dependent on her approval. She had been systematically destroying our child's mental health for months. I confronted her the next morning, Christmas morning, with the video evidence on my phone. "What is this, Sarah? What are you doing to our son?" She looked at me with those cold blue eyes and smiled. Actually smiled. "I'm making him stronger," she said calmly, buttering her toast as if we were discussing the weather. "He was weak, Robert. Soft, living in a fantasy world where his childish scribblings mattered. I'm teaching him about real art, real standards." "You're torturing him," I said, my voice shaking with rage I'd never felt before. "I'm educating him. Something you could never do with your limited understanding of culture and sophistication." That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't about art. This was about control. Sarah had spent years slowly building a fortress of superiority around herself, and anyone who threatened her self-image had to be torn down. I looked back at our marriage with fresh eyes, and I saw the pattern. How she'd gradually isolated me from my friends, claiming they were beneath us. How she'd made me feel guilty for enjoying simple pleasures like watching sports or going fishing with my brother. How she'd convinced me that my work, my efforts to provide for our family, were somehow shameful. I'd been so focused on being a good husband, a provider, that I'd missed the signs. The way she'd started staying out later and later, claiming she was at art galleries or museums. The way she'd become secretive about her phone, her emails, her financial activities. Yes, financial activities. Because that Christmas morning, as we sat in our kitchen with the world falling apart around us, I asked her about our money. "Sarah, I need to see our bank statements." "Why?" "Because I earn every dollar that goes into our account, and I have a right to know where it's going." She laughed, but it was a harsh sound like breaking glass. "You really don't know, do you? You sweet, stupid man." She opened her laptop and showed me our accounts. What I saw made my hands shake. Over the past 2 years, she'd moved over $40,000 into private accounts I knew nothing about. Money I'd earned working 16-hour days, money I'd saved by buying generic groceries and wearing the same clothes year after year. But it was worse than that. She'd been investing in stocks, cryptocurrency, even Bitcoin, using our money to build a private fortune I had no access to. The wealth she'd accumulated was substantial, maybe close to $100,000 by now. "This is our money," I said quietly. "This is my money," she corrected. "I'm the one with the education. I'm the one with the financial intelligence to invest it properly. You would have just left it sitting in a savings account earning nothing. You stole from our family. I invested in our future. My future." The emphasis on "my" wasn't lost on me. That afternoon, while Sarah was out, I had a long conversation with Michael. We sat in our small living room, Chicago's skyline visible through our window, and I told him everything. About the camera, about his mother's systematic cruelty, about the money. My son cried, deep, body-shaking sobs that came from somewhere I'd never seen him access before. "Dad, I thought I was going crazy. I thought maybe I really was worthless, like she said. I've been so depressed I could barely get out of bed most days. Son, you are not worthless. You are the best thing that ever happened to me. Your mother, she's sick. What she's been doing to you, it's not normal, it's not love. What are we going to do? I looked at my 22-year-old son, at this young man who should have been confident and excited about his future, and I made a decision that terrified me. We're going to get help, and we're going to get out. The next few weeks were the hardest of my life. I consulted with a lawyer in downtown Chicago, a woman named Janet Martinez who specialized in family law and financial abuse. She explained that what Sarah had been doing constituted several forms of legal wrongdoing, including financial fraud and psychological abuse. Mr. Thompson, she said, you have grounds for divorce, certainly. But more importantly, you have grounds to protect your son and recover your stolen assets. I'd never thought of myself as someone who would get divorced. In my generation, in my family, marriage was supposed to be forever. But forever doesn't mean accepting cruelty. Sarah fought back immediately when she realized what was happening. She accused me of lying, of trying to steal her art supplies, of being jealous of her intelligence. She told our few remaining friends that I was having a mental breakdown, that I was becoming paranoid and controlling, but I had the video evidence. I had bank records. I had Michael's testimony about months of psychological torture. The legal process was slow and painful, but something unexpected happened during those winter months. I started healing. I found an apartment in Wicker Park, a neighborhood I'd always loved but never thought I could afford. It was small but bright, with windows that actually let in sunlight, and walls that weren't covered with Sarah's increasingly dark artwork. Michael moved with me immediately. Within days of being away from his mother's constant criticism, he started to improve. He began drawing again, simple sketches at first, then more complex pieces. His humor returned. His appetite returned. The light came back to his eyes. I also made an unexpected friend during this time. Grace Kowalski, a 70-year-old widow who lived in the apartment below ours, became like a mother to both Michael and me. She'd knock on our door with homemade soup, with fresh bread, with stories about her late husband and her own struggles with difficult family members. "Robert," she said one evening as we sat in her kitchen drinking tea, "sometimes the people who are supposed to love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. But that doesn't mean we deserved it." Grace had her own story of financial abuse, of a son who had stolen her retirement savings and disappeared. But she'd rebuilt her life, learned to trust again, found joy in small things. "You're 63, she told me. "That's not old, that's experienced. You have years ahead of you to be happy, really happy. Don't waste them feeling guilty for protecting yourself and your son." The divorce was finalized 6 months later. I recovered most of the stolen money, though Sarah had spent a substantial amount on art supplies and what the court determined were frivolous purchases. She was ordered to pay restitution and to have no contact with Michael unless he specifically requested it. Michael chose to have no contact with her. The psychological damage she'd inflicted was too deep, too deliberate. He started therapy and slowly began to understand that her treatment of him had been a form of abuse, not love. But here's what I want you to understand about financial abuse, because I think many people in my generation don't recognize it when it's happening to them. It's not just about someone stealing your money, though. That's part of it. It's about someone using money to control you, to make you feel powerless, to convince you that you don't deserve to have any say in how your own earnings are used. Sarah had been doing this to me for years. Every time I wanted to buy something for myself, even something as simple as a new pair of shoes, she'd make me feel guilty. She'd talk about all the important things she needed money for: her art, her education, her projects. She made me believe that my desires were selfish and her needs were sophisticated. She controlled our social life by controlling our spending. We couldn't afford to go out with friends because she needed new canvases. We couldn't take vacations because she had enrolled in another expensive workshop. We couldn't even afford basic maintenance on our apartment because every dollar had to go toward her artistic pursuits. And all the while, she was building a secret fortune with my money, investing in stocks and cryptocurrency, accumulating wealth that she had no intention of sharing. This kind of financial abuse is more common than people realize, especially among older adults. Sometimes it's adult children who systematically drain their parents' accounts. Sometimes it's spouses who use joint resources to build private wealth. Sometimes it's relatives who convince elderly family members to sign over power of attorney and then loot their estates. In my case, it took me years to recognize what was happening because I'd been raised to believe that questioning my wife's financial decisions made me a bad husband. I thought trust meant giving her complete access to everything I earned without asking questions. But trust should never mean giving up your right to know where your money goes. The psychological abuse was harder to recognize and even harder to prove. What Sarah did to Michael, the systematic destruction of his self-esteem, the deliberate replacement of his joyful artwork with her dark, oppressive images, the nighttime whispers designed to make him feel worthless. These things leave scars that don't show up on bank statements. Michael's therapist explained that this kind of psychological manipulation is sometimes called gaslighting, making someone question their own perceptions and memories. Sarah had convinced our son that his natural artistic instincts were wrong, that his happiness was misguided, that his very existence was somehow a disappointment. She did similar things to me, though more subtly. She convinced me that my work was beneath her, that my interests were unsophisticated, that my friends were not worth keeping. She made me believe that I was lucky to have her, that no other woman would want a simple deli worker who smelled like meat and had calloused hands. But you know what I learned? There's dignity in honest work. There's beauty in simple pleasures. There's value in relationships that don't require you to constantly prove your worth. After the divorce, I kept working at Romano's Deli, but I also started taking evening classes at the community college. Art classes, actually. I discovered that I had a talent for watercolor painting, something I never would have explored while I was married to someone who insisted that only her artistic vision mattered. Michael and I started taking weekend trips around Chicago, visiting museums and galleries, but also just walking through neighborhoods we'd never seen before. We'd stop at small restaurants, try foods from different cultures, buy books from street vendors. Simple pleasures that Sarah would have dismissed as unsophisticated became treasures to us. I also reconnected with my brother Tom, who lived in Milwaukee. Sarah had gradually convinced me that Tom was a bad influence, that his blue-collar lifestyle and simple tastes were holding me back from becoming more refined. But when I called him after the divorce, he drove down to Chicago that same weekend. "Rob," he said as we sat in a bar near Wrigley Field, "I missed you, man. I didn't know what happened, but you just disappeared from our family." I realized that Sarah had isolated me from everyone who might have noticed what was happening, everyone who might have encouraged me to stand up for myself. The hardest part of healing wasn't the legal battles or the financial struggles. It was learning to trust my own judgment again. After years of being told that my perceptions were wrong, that my feelings didn't matter, that my contributions weren't valuable, I had to relearn how to make decisions based on what I actually wanted, not what someone else expected from me. I started small. I bought myself a comfortable chair for our new apartment, something Sarah would have said was unnecessary and expensive. I enrolled in a cooking class, something she would have claimed was a waste of time since she was already an excellent cook. I adopted a dog from the local shelter, a gentle golden retriever mix named Charlie, something Sarah never would have allowed because dogs were messy and expensive. Each small act of independence felt like a victory. But I want to be honest with you about something. Even now, 2 years later, I sometimes wonder if I did the right thing. There are nights when I lie in bed in our quiet apartment, listening to Michael breathing peacefully in the next room, and I think about the good times Sarah and I had together. Because there were good times, especially in the early years. She could be charming, funny, intellectually stimulating. She introduced me to art, to books, to ideas I never would have encountered on my own. When she was happy, when her artwork was going well, when she felt appreciated, she could make me feel like the most important person in the world. I think this is what makes emotional and financial abuse so confusing for people who experience it. The abuser isn't cruel all the time. They can be loving, generous, supportive when it serves their purposes. They create a cycle where you're constantly trying to get back to those good times, constantly wondering if you can do something different to make them happy again. But I learned something important from my therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Patricia Williams, who specialized in helping older adults recover from abusive relationships. She told me that intermittent reinforcement, the pattern of mixing kindness with cruelty, is actually one of the most addictive psychological patterns humans can experience. "Robert," she said, "slot machines work on the same principle. They pay out just often enough to keep people pulling the lever, hoping for the next jackpot. Sarah gave you just enough affection and approval to keep you hoping that if you just tried harder, gave more, worked longer hours, she would love you the way you deserve to be loved. But she did love me sometimes. Love isn't something you earn by accepting abuse. Love should be consistent, respectful, reciprocal. What Sarah gave you wasn't love, it was control. That was a hard lesson to accept. I'd been raised to believe that marriage required sacrifice, that love meant putting your partner's needs before your own. But I learned there's a difference between healthy compromise and self-destruction. Now let me tell you about the moment I knew I'd really healed. It was a Saturday afternoon about 18 months after the divorce. Michael and I were in Grant Park, walking Charlie and enjoying the spring weather. We stopped at a food truck for hot dogs, and I was watching my son laugh at something on his phone when I realized something profound had changed. I was happy. Not just content, not just relieved to be away from conflict, but genuinely happy. I looked forward to waking up in the morning. I enjoyed my work more because I wasn't constantly worried about what crisis would be waiting for me at home. I had energy for activities and relationships beyond just surviving each day. Michael noticed it too. "Dad," he said as we sat on a bench overlooking the lake, "you smile all the time now. I don't remember you smiling much when Mom lived with us." He was right. I'd been so focused on managing Sarah's moods, on walking on eggshells to avoid triggering her anger or disappointment, that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without fear. That's when I understood that leaving wasn't just about protecting myself and Michael from further harm. It was about reclaiming our right to joy. I want to pause here and ask you something because I know some of you watching this might be living in situations that feel familiar. Have you ever found yourself constantly trying to earn someone's love? Have you ever felt like you have to justify your own feelings or defend your right to basic respect? Have you ever noticed that you've lost contact with friends or family members because someone in your life convinced you they weren't worth maintaining relationships with? If any of this sounds familiar, please know that you deserve better. Age doesn't make you less deserving of respect. Years of marriage don't obligate you to accept cruelty. Financial dependence doesn't mean you have no rights. I know it's scary to consider making changes, especially when you're older and worried about starting over. I was terrified. At 63, I thought I was too old to rebuild my life, too set in my ways to learn new patterns, too financially precarious to risk disrupting the status quo. But you know what I discovered? Starting over at 63 wasn't the end of my life. It was the beginning of the best years I'd had in decades. Now, I need to tell you about something that happened just when I thought our story was settled, when I believed the worst was behind us. It was a Tuesday evening in late fall, about 2 years after the divorce was finalized. Michael and I were having dinner in our kitchen, talking about his plans to start taking photography classes, when my phone rang. It was Janet Martinez, my lawyer. "Robert, I need you to sit down. We've discovered something about Sarah's finances that changes everything." It turned out that Sarah's investment activities had been far more extensive than anyone realized. She hadn't just been moving our household money into private accounts. She'd been running a sophisticated financial scheme involving multiple fake identities and fraudulent investment claims. "She's been arrested," Janet told me. "The FBI raided her apartment this morning. Robert, she stole money from at least 12 other people, mostly older men she met through online dating sites. The total amount is close to $500,000. The woman I'd been married to for 25 years was a criminal, not just someone who'd made bad choices or let greed get the better of her, but someone who had been systematically defrauding vulnerable people for years." "Did she steal from us while we were married?" I asked. "It looks like your divorce settlement actually helped uncover the larger scheme." When she was required to disclose her assets, investigators noticed discrepancies that led them to discover the fraud. "Robert, you may have saved other people from being victimized." I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen, trying to process this information. Michael looked at me with concern. "Dad, what's wrong?" I told him about the call, about his mother's arrest, about the scope of her criminal activities. My son was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. "Dad, I'm not surprised. I always felt like she was performing being our family, like we were just props in some story she was telling herself. I never felt like she really saw us as real people." He was right. Sarah had treated us like characters in her personal drama, useful when we served her purposes, obstacles to be managed when we didn't. She'd never seen us as individuals with our own needs, dreams, and rights. The investigation revealed that she'd been using the psychological manipulation techniques she'd perfected on Michael and me to exploit other victims. She'd identify lonely, financially stable older men and gradually convince them that she was a struggling artist who just needed a little help to achieve success. She'd promised them romance, companionship, a future together, while systematically draining their retirement accounts and investment portfolios. Several of her victims had lost their life savings. One man had mortgaged his house to give her money for what she claimed was a groundbreaking art exhibition that would make them all wealthy. Another had given her his late wife's jewelry to sell, believing her story that she needed emergency medical treatment. The cruelest part was how she'd discarded each victim once she'd taken everything she could get from them. She'd simply disappear, blocking their calls, closing email accounts, moving on to the next target. Learning about this helped me understand that what happened to Michael and me wasn't personal failure on our parts. We weren't uniquely gullible or weak. Sarah was a predator who had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying and exploiting people's vulnerabilities. But it also made me angry in a way I hadn't been before. Angry for all those other men who'd trusted her, who'd been lonely enough to believe her promises, who'd lost not just money but their faith in human connection. I testified at her trial. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, sitting in that courtroom, looking at the woman I'd once loved, and telling a room full of strangers about the financial and emotional abuse she'd inflicted on our family. Sarah showed no remorse. Even facing federal fraud charges, she maintained that she was the victim, that everyone else had misunderstood her intentions, that her actions had been justified by her artistic vision and financial intelligence. She was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. I thought that would bring me closure, but it didn't. Not immediately. Instead, it forced me to confront some difficult questions about my own judgment, my own choices, my own responsibility for what happened. How had I lived with someone for 25 years without seeing who she really was? What did it say about me that I'd been so easily manipulated? Had I failed Michael by not protecting him sooner? These were the questions that kept me awake at night in the months following the trial. But Grace, my neighbor who had become like family to us, helped me understand something important. "Robert," she said one evening as we sat on her small balcony watching the sunset over Chicago, "you weren't stupid for trusting your wife. You were having normal human reactions to someone who was exceptionally skilled at deception. The problem wasn't that you loved too much or trusted too easily. The problem was that she exploited those qualities for her own gain. But I should have seen the signs." Should you have? Really? Think about it. She spent decades learning how to hide her true nature. She studied you, learned your weaknesses, your fears, your hopes, and used that information against you. That's not something a normal person would think to look for because it's not something a normal person would do. Grace was right. I'd been approaching the relationship with the assumption that Sarah shared my basic values of honesty, reciprocity, and genuine care for family. When someone operates from a completely different moral framework, when they see relationships as opportunities for exploitation rather than connection, it's nearly impossible to detect until the damage is already done. This realization helped me forgive myself, but it also taught me something important about recognizing unhealthy patterns in relationships. Now, when I meet new people, I pay attention to different things than I used to. I notice whether they ask questions about my life or only talk about themselves. I observe how they treat service workers, how they speak about former relationships, how they handle disappointment or conflict. Most importantly, I've learned to trust my instincts when something feels wrong, even if I can't articulate exactly what the problem is. But I don't want to give you the impression that I've become cynical or closed off from connection. Actually, the opposite has happened. 6 months ago, I met someone. Her name is Ellen, and she's a retired teacher who volunteers at the same community center where I've been teaching basic financial literacy to older adults. She's kind, straightforward, and refreshingly direct about her thoughts and feelings. Our relationship has developed slowly, carefully, with complete honesty about our past experiences and future expectations. She knows about Sarah, about the abuse, about the fraud conviction. I know about her difficult first marriage, her struggles with depression after her husband left her for a younger woman, her journey back to self-confidence. We don't live together, and we may never choose to. We both value our independence too much now. But we enjoy each other's company, we support each other's goals, and we bring out the best in each other, rather than trying to control or change each other. Ellen has helped me understand that healthy relationships feel easy in a way that my marriage to Sarah never did. There's no walking on eggshells, no constant analysis of moods and reactions, no feeling like I have to earn affection through performance or sacrifice. "Robert," she told me recently, "with you, I feel like I can just be myself. I don't have to pretend to be more sophisticated or less opinionated or anything other than who I am. That's what love should feel like." She's right. Love shouldn't be work in the sense of constant effort to avoid conflict or meet impossible standards. Love should be work in the sense of commitment, communication, and mutual growth, but it should never feel like survival. Michael has thrived in ways I couldn't have imagined 2 years ago. He's now 24, working as a freelance graphic designer, and seriously dating a wonderful young woman named Lisa, who encourages his artistic pursuits and treats him with the respect and affection he deserves. He's also become an advocate for other young adults who've experienced psychological abuse from family members. He volunteers with a local organization that helps people recognize and recover from various forms of domestic violence. "Dad," he told me recently, "what Mom did to us was terrible, but it taught me things about myself I never would have learned otherwise. I know now that I'm stronger than I thought. I know I can survive fear and doubt and still come out on the other side. I know I deserve to be treated with kindness." Watching him rebuild his confidence, seeing him create art that reflects joy rather than fear, knowing that he's learned to trust his own judgment and set healthy boundaries in relationships, These things give meaning to our suffering. Not that the suffering was necessary or justified, but that we've been able to transform it into wisdom and strength. I need to tell you about one more thing, because it represents the most important change in my life. Last month, I did something I never could have imagined when I was married to Sarah. I bought myself a small house in a quiet neighborhood on Chicago's North Side. It's nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom bungalow with a small yard and a garage, but it's mine. For the first time in my adult life, I own property that nobody else can take away from me. I make decisions about paint colors, furniture, landscaping, financial investments, without having to justify or defend my choices to anyone else. The morning I got the keys, I stood in my empty living room and cried. Not from sadness, but from a kind of overwhelming gratitude for the simple freedom to exist in a space that reflects my own taste and priorities. Michael helped me move in, and we spent the first evening sitting on my small back porch, drinking beer and watching Charlie chase squirrels in the yard. "Dad," he said, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't installed that camera?" I'd thought about this many times. If I hadn't seen the video evidence of Sarah's psychological torture, would I have ever found the courage to leave? Would Michael have eventually had a complete emotional breakdown? Would Sarah have escalated her abuse to even more dangerous levels? I think we would have died inside, I told him honestly. Not physically, but emotionally, spiritually. I think we would have become shells of ourselves, just going through the motions of living without actually experiencing joy or hope or genuine connection. I'm glad you were brave enough to find out the truth. Brave. I'd never thought of myself as brave. But maybe courage isn't the absence of fear. Maybe it's the willingness to act in spite of fear when something important is at stake. I was terrified to confront Sarah. I was terrified to get divorced at 63. I was terrified to start over financially, socially, emotionally, but I was more terrified of what would happen to Michael and me if we stayed. Now, I want to speak directly to anyone who might be living in a situation similar to what I experienced. Maybe you're being financially controlled by a spouse or adult child. Maybe someone in your life consistently makes you feel small, inadequate, or ungrateful. Maybe you've lost contact with friends and family because someone convinced you they were bad influences. Maybe you feel like you're walking on eggshells, constantly trying to manage someone else's moods and reactions. If any of this sounds familiar, please know that it's not normal, and it's not your fault. You deserve to be treated with respect, regardless of your age, your income, your education level, or your past mistakes. You deserve to have input into financial decisions that affect your life. You deserve to maintain relationships with people who care about you. You deserve to feel safe and comfortable in your own home. Getting help can feel impossible, especially if you've been isolated or convinced that no one would believe your story. But resources exist, even if they're not immediately obvious. Every major city has elder abuse hotlines and domestic violence organizations that specifically help older adults. Many banks now have procedures to identify and report financial abuse. Legal aid societies often provide free or low-cost services to people who've been defrauded by family members or intimate partners. Most importantly, trust your instincts. If a relationship feels wrong, if you're constantly anxious or walking on eggshells, if you've lost touch with activities and people you used to enjoy, these are signs that something needs to change. You're not too old to start over. You're not too stuck in your ways to learn new patterns. You're not too financially precarious to risk making changes. I know this because I lived it. At 63, I thought my life was essentially over, that my best years were behind me, that I was too old and too set in my ways to build something new. But these past 2 years have been among the happiest of my life. I've discovered interests and talents I never knew I had. I've formed relationships based on mutual respect rather than dependency or obligation. I've learned to make decisions based on what I actually want, rather than what someone else expects from me. I wake up in my own house, in my own bed, and I feel grateful for the simple peace of not having to manage someone else's moods or defend my right to exist. I make my coffee the way I like it. I read books that interest me. I spend money on things that bring me joy without having to justify those purchases to anyone else. These might seem like small freedoms, but they represent something profound: the right to be yourself in your own life. The other day, Ellen and I were walking through Lincoln Park, talking about our plans for the weekend, when I realized something that made me stop walking. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Nothing's wrong," I said. "I just realized that I'm not afraid anymore. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I'm not afraid of saying the wrong thing, or making someone angry, or disappointing someone. I'm just living." That's what healing looks like, I think. Not the absence of problems or challenges, but the absence of fear as the dominant emotion in your daily life. If you're watching this and recognizing your own situation in my story, If you're feeling that familiar, tight feeling in your chest that comes from being chronically undervalued and disrespected, I want you to know that change is possible. It won't be easy. There will be moments when you doubt yourself, when you wonder if you're overreacting, when the fear of being alone feels stronger than the pain of staying in a harmful situation. But you have more strength than you realize. You have more options than you can see right now, and you deserve better than what you're accepting. I'm 65 years old now. I own my own home. I have a healthy relationship with my son. I'm in love with a woman who treats me like an equal partner rather than a source of services or money. I have hobbies I enjoy and friends I can be honest with. 2 years ago, none of this seemed possible. I thought I was trapped by age, by finances, by the complications of extricating myself from a long marriage. I thought I was too old to start over, and too tired to fight for something better. I was wrong about all of it. Your age is not a limitation. It's an opportunity to use your experience and wisdom to make better choices. Your financial situation might be complicated, but it's not impossible to change. Your relationships might be entangled, but they're not permanent if they're harmful. You have the right to spend whatever years you have left feeling respected, valued, and genuinely cared for. You have the right to make choices about your own money, your own time, your own living situation. You have the right to relationships that energize you rather than drain you. But claiming those rights requires action. It requires making difficult decisions and having uncomfortable conversations. It requires getting help from professionals who understand financial abuse and psychological manipulation. It requires building a support network of people who see your value and want to help you protect it. Most of all, it requires believing that you deserve better, even when someone has spent years convincing you that you don't. I used to think that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that admitting my marriage was abusive meant I'd failed as a husband. I thought that protecting myself meant abandoning my responsibilities to my family, but I learned that asking for help is actually a sign of strength, that recognizing abuse means you're finally seeing clearly, and that protecting yourself often means protecting the people you love most. Michael is healthier and happier because I found the courage to leave his mother. Our relationship is deeper and more honest because I stopped pretending that our family was functional when it wasn't. I'm healthier and happier because I stopped sacrificing my well-being to maintain someone else's comfort. I have the energy now to be truly present for the people I care about because I'm not spending all my emotional resources trying to survive each day. That's what recovery looks like. Not perfection, not the absence of challenges, but the presence of choices, and the freedom to make decisions based on what's actually best for you and the people who genuinely care about your well-being. As I finish telling you this story, I'm sitting in my kitchen, looking out at my small backyard where Charlie is sleeping in a patch of afternoon sunlight. Michael will be here for dinner in an hour. Ellen and I are going to a movie tonight. Tomorrow I'm volunteering at the community center, then having lunch with Grace, then working on a watercolor painting I've been excited about all week. These are simple pleasures, ordinary moments, but they represent everything I thought I'd lost forever when I was living with Sarah. They represent peace, choice, and the basic human right to enjoy your own life. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, if something about my experience has resonated with your own life or the life of someone you care about, I want to ask you to do something. First, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Sharing these stories helps other people realize they're not alone, that their experiences have names, and that change is possible even when it feels impossible. Second, if you're currently in a situation that feels similar to what I described, please reach out for help. Call a domestic violence hotline, talk to a trusted friend, consult with a lawyer or therapist who specializes in family abuse. You don't have to figure this out alone, and you don't have to stay trapped because you're afraid or ashamed or convinced that no one will understand. Third, if someone in your life is showing signs of being financially or emotionally abused, offer your support without judgment. Sometimes just knowing that one person believes them and wants to help can give someone the courage to take the first step toward freedom. Most importantly, remember that it's never too late to reclaim your right to be treated with dignity and respect. Age doesn't make you less deserving of kindness. Years of accepting poor treatment don't obligate you to continue accepting it forever. You have value that exists independent of what you can provide for other people. You have the right to relationships that reciprocate your care rather than exploit it. You have the right to financial security and decision-making power over your own resources. And you have the right to spend whatever time you have left on this earth feeling genuinely loved rather than merely tolerated. My story isn't over. At 65, I feel like I'm just beginning to understand who I am when I'm not trying to earn someone else's approval. I'm curious about what I'll discover about myself in the coming years, what new relationships I'll form, what challenges I'll overcome, what joys await me. That's what healing ultimately gave me. Not just relief from pain, but excitement about the future. The knowledge that my best days don't have to be behind me, that growth and change and happiness are possible at any age. I hope that message reaches someone who needs to hear it today. I hope it gives you the courage to take one small step toward protecting yourself, toward building the life you actually want, rather than the life someone else expects from you. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for allowing me to share something so personal and painful and ultimately hopeful. And thank you for reminding me that our struggles have meaning when they help other people feel less alone. But before I end, let me tell you about something that happened just last week that really drove home how much my life has changed and why I'm so passionate about sharing this story with you. I was at the grocery store, Romano's actually, where I used to work. I don't shop there often anymore since I moved to the north side, but I was in the old neighborhood visiting Grace. As I was picking out some of the Italian meats I used to slice every day, I heard a voice behind me. Robert? Robert Thompson? I turned around and saw Carol Martinez, a woman who used to bring her elderly father to the deli every Tuesday for 20 years. Her father had passed away during the worst period of my marriage, and I remembered feeling so overwhelmed with my own problems that I hadn't been able to attend his funeral. I'd felt terrible about it at the time. "Carol, how are you?" I said, genuinely happy to see her. "I'm doing well, Robert. I heard about your divorce, and I wanted to tell you something. My father always said you were the nicest man he'd ever met, always patient with his orders, always asked about his health. But in his last few months, he started worrying about you. Worrying about me? He said you seemed so tired, so sad. He could see it in your eyes. He told me once, that nice man at the deli is carrying too much weight on his shoulders. Someone's not treating him right." My dad had a way of seeing people, you know. He grew up during the Depression, knew what real hardship looked like, but he also knew what it looked like when someone was being worn down by life. I felt tears start to form in my eyes. This elderly man I'd served for 2 decades had seen my pain when I couldn't even acknowledge it myself. "He would have been so happy to see you now," Carol continued, looking at me carefully. "You look lighter, like whatever was weighing you down is gone. You're standing up straighter. Your eyes have life in them again." That conversation stayed with me for days. It made me realize that the effects of emotional and financial abuse aren't just internal. Other people can see it, even when we think we're hiding it successfully. The exhaustion, the constant vigilance, the way you carry yourself when you're always bracing for criticism or conflict, it's visible to anyone who cares enough to look. But what struck me most was Carol's observation about how I look now. Because she was right. I do feel lighter. I do stand straighter. For the first time in decades, I'm not carrying the weight of someone else's anger, disappointment, and expectations on my shoulders. This is what freedom feels like. Not just the absence of abuse, but the presence of authentic self-expression. The ability to make choices based on your own values rather than someone else's demands. The energy that comes from not having to constantly manage another person's emotions. I want to talk about something else that I think is crucial for people in my generation to understand. The role that social isolation plays in keeping us trapped in abusive situations. When Sarah was systematically separating me from my friends and family, it wasn't obvious or dramatic. She didn't forbid me from seeing people or explicitly prevent me from maintaining relationships. Instead, she made it emotionally costly and practically difficult. For instance, when my brother Tom would invite us to family gatherings, Sarah would always find reasons why we couldn't go. She'd have an art opening the same weekend, or she'd scheduled an important meeting with a gallery owner, or she'd suddenly develop a migraine that made travel impossible. After a while, Tom stopped inviting us, and I was too embarrassed to explain what was happening. When old friends from work would suggest getting together for drinks, Sarah would make comments about how I needed to be more selective about my social circle, how these people weren't sophisticated enough to understand our lifestyle, how I was wasting time I could be spending on more meaningful activities like supporting her art career. The isolation happened so gradually that I didn't recognize it as a deliberate strategy. I thought I was just growing apart from people naturally, the way adults sometimes do as their lives change. I didn't realize that Sarah was manufacturing these changes to increase my dependence on her approval and reduce my access to outside perspectives that might have helped me see our relationship more clearly. This kind of social isolation is particularly dangerous for older adults because we're already dealing with natural changes in our social networks. Friends move away, retire to different cities, or pass away. Adult children get busy with their own lives and careers. If someone is deliberately accelerating this isolation, it can happen very quickly and feel very natural. But social connections aren't just nice to have, they're essential for mental health and personal safety. Other people provide reality checks when someone is trying to distort your perception of events. They offer practical support when you need to make difficult changes. They remind you of who you are beyond your role in one particular relationship. Now that I'm on the other side of this experience, I've made it a priority to rebuild and maintain social connections intentionally. I have coffee with Grace at least twice a week. I call Tom every Sunday. I've joined a watercolor painting group that meets monthly. I volunteer at the community center partly because I enjoy the work, but also because it keeps me connected to a diverse group of people with different perspectives and experiences. These relationships aren't just pleasant additions to my life, they're part of my protection system. If I ever found myself in another unhealthy relationship, these people would notice changes in my behavior and well-being. They would ask questions and offer support. They would help me maintain perspective about what's normal and what's not. I also want to address something that might be uncomfortable for some people to hear, but that I think is important, especially for men in my generation who might be experiencing abuse. There's a stigma around being a male victim of domestic abuse, whether it's financial, emotional, or physical. We're supposed to be strong, independent providers, protectors. The idea that we could be manipulated, controlled, or victimized by our wives or other family members challenges fundamental assumptions about masculinity and relationships. When I first started recognizing what Sarah was doing to Michael and me, I felt deeply ashamed. Not just about the abuse itself, but about my failure to recognize it sooner, to stand up to it more effectively, to protect my son and myself better. I worried that people would think I was weak, that I'd allowed myself to be pushed around, that I somehow deserved what was happening because I hadn't been man enough to stop it. But Dr. Williams, my therapist, helped me understand that these feelings, while natural, were actually part of what had kept me trapped for so long. The shame about being victimized can become another form of imprisonment, preventing us from seeking help and making the changes necessary to protect ourselves. Robert, she said during one particularly difficult session, strength isn't about never being vulnerable to manipulation. Strength is about recognizing when someone is taking advantage of your trust and love, and having the courage to protect yourself and your son even when it's difficult and scary. She was right. The strongest thing I ever did wasn't enduring years of financial and emotional abuse. The strongest thing I did was installing that camera, confronting Sarah with the evidence, and taking every necessary step to get Michael and myself to safety. Real strength sometimes looks like admitting you need help. Real courage sometimes means acknowledging that a situation you've tolerated for years is actually unacceptable. Real masculinity includes protecting the people you love from harm, even when the threat comes from within your own family. I hope that male viewers who might be experiencing similar situations will hear this message. You are not weak for being manipulated by someone you trusted. You are not failing as a man because someone is taking advantage of your commitment to your relationship or family. And you are not trapped, no matter how impossible change might seem right now. Let me share one more story that illustrates just how much abuse can distort your perception of reality and normal behavior. About 6 months into my relationship with Ellen, we were at a restaurant celebrating her birthday. The service was slow, and our server seemed overwhelmed by a busy Saturday night crowd. When she finally brought our meals, Ellen's was incorrect, not what she had ordered. I immediately tensed up, bracing myself for what I assumed would happen next. Anger, criticism of the server, demands to speak to the manager. A dramatic scene that would embarrass everyone involved. That's how Sarah would have handled any service issue, turning every minor inconvenience into an opportunity to assert her superiority and make other people feel small. But Ellen just smiled at the server and said, "Excuse me, I think there might have been a mix-up with my order. Would it be possible to get the salmon instead of the chicken when you have a chance? No rush, I can see you're really busy tonight." The server apologized, took the plate back, and returned with the correct meal a few minutes later. Ellen thanked her warmly and left a generous tip despite the mistake. The entire interaction was kind, respectful, and solution-focused. "Are you okay?" Ellen asked me as we left the restaurant. "You seemed tense during dinner." I realized that I'd been holding my breath through the whole incident, waiting for conflict that never came. I'd been so conditioned to expect every minor problem to become a major confrontation that I couldn't relax even in the presence of normal, healthy communication. That's when I understood how deeply abuse had affected my nervous system and my expectations about how people treat each other. I'd forgotten that disagreements don't have to become battles, that mistakes don't have to become ammunition for character assassination, that you can advocate for yourself without destroying other people. Ellen's response to a simple restaurant error showed me what emotional maturity and basic human decency actually look like. It reminded me that most conflicts can be resolved with kindness and direct communication, that you don't need to punish people for being imperfect. This is one of the most insidious effects of psychological abuse. It recalibrates your expectations about how people behave toward each other. When you're constantly walking on eggshells, when every conversation is a potential minefield, When normal human imperfections trigger disproportionate anger and criticism, you lose touch with what healthy relationships feel like. Recovery involves not just leaving the abusive situation, but relearning what normal interactions look like. It means practicing having needs and expressing them clearly without expecting retaliation. It means learning to trust that people can disagree with you without rejecting you, that making mistakes doesn't make you worthless, that asking for what you need isn't selfish. I'm still learning these lessons. Sometimes I catch myself apologizing excessively for minor inconveniences, or over-explaining my decisions as if I need permission to make choices about my own life. But I'm getting better at recognizing these patterns and gently correcting them. This healing process isn't just about individual recovery, it's about breaking cycles that can affect multiple generations. Think about what Michael learned from watching Sarah's behavior for 22 years. He absorbed lessons about how partners treat each other, how parents interact with children, how conflicts are resolved, how decisions are made in families. If I hadn't found the courage to leave, Michael might have grown up thinking that love involves criticism, that partnerships require one person to sacrifice their identity for the other's ambitions, that financial control is normal in relationships. He might have become either an abuser himself or attracted to partners who would treat him the way his mother treated him and me. But because we got out, because we both did the work of healing and learning new patterns, Michael has different models for what healthy relationships look like. He's seen that it's possible to love someone without trying to control them, to support someone's dreams without sacrificing your own, to disagree respectfully without character assassination. Lisa, his girlfriend, comes from a family where mutual respect and open communication are normal. Watching Michael navigate that relationship, seeing how naturally he's adapted to healthy patterns of interaction, gives me hope that the damage Sarah inflicted won't be passed down to future generations. This is why recovery matters not just for the individual victims, but for everyone whose lives are touched by abuse. When we heal ourselves, we create ripple effects of health and wellness that extend far beyond our immediate circumstances. Now let me address something that I know some viewers might be thinking. What if you're wrong? What if you leave a relationship thinking you're escaping abuse, but you're actually just abandoning someone who needs your help and commitment? This was one of my biggest fears when I was considering divorce. What if Sarah's behavior was the result of stress, depression, or other mental health issues that could be treated? What if I was giving up on our marriage just when she needed my support most? What if I was being selfish, choosing my own comfort over my commitment to work through difficult times together? These are valid concerns, and I think they deserve honest consideration. There's a difference between a relationship that's going through a difficult period and a relationship that's fundamentally abusive. There's a difference between someone who's struggling with mental health issues and someone who's deliberately exploiting your vulnerabilities for their own gain. Here are some questions that helped me clarify this distinction. Is the problematic behavior getting worse over time? Or are there periods of genuine improvement? Sarah's psychological manipulation of Michael had escalated steadily over months. There was no indication that she recognized it as problematic or had any interest in changing it. When you try to address issues directly, is the person willing to acknowledge the problem and work toward solutions? Every time I attempted to discuss my concerns with Sarah, she deflected, blamed me, or dismissed my feelings as invalid. She showed no interest in understanding my perspective or modifying her behavior. Are they taking responsibility for their actions, or do they consistently portray themselves as the victim? Even after being confronted with video evidence of her psychological torture of Michael, Sarah maintained that she was helping him and that I was the problem for interfering with her methods. Do they show empathy for how their behavior affects you and other family members? Sarah seemed incapable of recognizing or caring about the emotional damage she was inflicting on Michael. She viewed his distress as weakness rather than evidence that her approach was harmful. Most importantly, do you feel safe expressing your concerns, needs, and boundaries? Or do you find yourself constantly editing yourself to avoid triggering their anger or disappointment? In a healthy relationship, even during difficult times, both partners should feel free to be honest about their feelings and needs. If someone is genuinely struggling with mental health issues, but is committed to recovery and maintaining respectful relationships, they'll welcome conversations about how their behavior affects others. They'll take responsibility for getting professional help when needed. They'll make efforts to minimize the impact of their struggles on family members. But if someone consistently refuses to acknowledge problems, shows no empathy for how their behavior affects others, and becomes angry or punitive when confronted with evidence of harm they're causing, those are signs of character issues rather than mental health struggles. I'm not suggesting that people should abandon partners or family members who are dealing with genuine mental health challenges. But there's a crucial difference between supporting someone through difficulties and enabling abuse by making excuses for unacceptable behavior. In Sarah's case, the systematic nature of her financial fraud, the deliberate psychological manipulation of Michael, and her complete lack of remorse when confronted all pointed to something more than mental health issues. These were calculated choices designed to serve her interests at our expense. Making the distinction can be difficult, especially when you love someone and want to believe the best about them. This is another reason why outside perspectives are so valuable. Therapists, counselors, domestic violence advocates, and trusted friends can help you evaluate whether a situation represents temporary struggles or fundamental patterns of abuse. Let me tell you about another aspect of recovery that surprised me: grief. Even though leaving Sarah was necessary for Michael's and my well-being, even though I'm infinitely happier now than I was during the marriage, I still went through a grieving process for the relationship I thought we had. I grieved for the Sarah I fell in love with 25 years ago, the woman who introduced me to art and literature and made me feel like I could be part of a more cultured, sophisticated world. I grieved for the dreams we'd shared about growing old together, traveling, maybe becoming grandparents someday. I grieved for the years I'd spent working toward goals that turned out to be illusions, all those extra shifts at the deli to support her art career, all the sacrifices I made thinking we were building something together, all the times I defended her to friends and family members who tried to warn me about concerning patterns they could see more clearly than I could. Most painfully, I grieved for Michael's childhood, for the father I could have been if I hadn't been so consumed with managing Sarah's moods and expectations. I wondered how many school events I'd missed, how many opportunities for real connection with my son had been lost because I was always focused on preventing or managing the next crisis with his mother. This grief was complicated because it coexisted with relief, anger, and hope for the future. I felt guilty about mourning the loss of a relationship that had been harmful, confused about missing someone who had caused so much pain. Dr. Williams helped me understand that this grief was not only normal, but necessary. "You're not mourning the relationship you actually had, Robert," she explained. "You're mourning the relationship you thought you had, the future you thought you were building, the person you believed Sarah to be. Those losses are real even if they were based on illusions." The grieving process took longer than I expected. There were days, especially in the first months after the divorce, when I felt overwhelmed by sadness about the waste of so many years, the damage done to Michael, the realization that someone I'd trusted completely had been deceiving me for so long. But gradually, the grief became less acute and more integrated into my overall understanding of the experience. I learned to honor the real love and hope I'd brought to the marriage without romanticizing the actual relationship or minimizing the harm that had been done. Now, when I think about those 25 years, I don't see them as entirely wasted. They taught me important lessons about my own values, my capacity for commitment, my ability to survive difficult circumstances. They gave me Michael, and they gave me experience that helps me recognize and avoid similar patterns in the future. The grief also taught me something important about the complexity of human relationships and human nature. Sarah wasn't entirely evil, just as she wasn't the angel I believed her to be in the early years. She was a complex person with both appealing and destructive qualities, someone whose issues ultimately made her unsafe for Michael and me to live with. Understanding this complexity helps me avoid the kind of black and white thinking that could make me either too trusting or too suspicious in future relationships. I can acknowledge that Sarah had some genuinely positive qualities while still maintaining that her behavior toward Michael and me was unacceptable, and that leaving was the right decision. This nuanced understanding has been crucial in my relationship with Ellen. I don't expect her to be perfect, and I'm not constantly looking for signs that she might be hiding dark secrets. But I do pay attention to how she handles disagreements, how she treats other people, how she responds when I express needs or concerns. I trust her, but it's an informed trust based on consistent evidence of her character rather than blind faith. As we approach the end of my story, I want to share what I consider the most important lesson I learned through this entire experience. The lesson is this: you teach people how to treat you not just through what you say, but through what you accept. For years, I accepted financial secrecy from Sarah because I believed that questioning her decisions made me a bad husband. I accepted psychological cruelty toward Michael because I didn't want to create conflict. I accepted being dismissed, criticized, and isolated because I thought that's what marriage sometimes required. But my acceptance of these behaviors didn't make me a good partner or father. It enabled increasingly dangerous behavior and taught Sarah that she could treat us however she wanted without consequences. When I finally started setting boundaries, when I insisted on transparency about our finances, when I refused to allow Michael to be psychologically tortured, when I demanded basic respect for myself, Sarah's response revealed her true character. A person with healthy intentions would have been willing to discuss these issues and make changes. Someone who genuinely loved us would have been concerned about our well-being and eager to address behaviors that were causing harm. Instead, Sarah became angry and defensive, accused me of being controlling and paranoid, and ultimately escalated her abusive behavior. Her reaction confirmed that she was more invested in maintaining control than in having a healthy relationship. This dynamic exists in all kinds of relationships, not just romantic ones. Adult children who financially exploit elderly parents rely on those parents accepting the exploitation as normal family support. Bosses who create hostile work environments depend on employees accepting unreasonable treatment as the price of keeping their jobs. Friends who consistently take without giving count on others, accepting one-sided relationships as just the way friendship works. But when you start requiring people to treat you with basic respect, when you stop accepting behavior that damages your well-being, you force them to either rise to higher standards or reveal that they're not capable of or interested in healthy relationships. Some people will rise to the occasion. They'll apologize for harmful behavior, make genuine changes, and become better partners, family members, or friends. These are the relationships worth investing in and fighting for. But others will resist your boundaries, become angry about your new expectations, and try to punish you for refusing to accept poor treatment. These reactions tell you everything you need to know about their character and their investment in your well-being. The most liberating realization I had was that I didn't have to accept mistreatment from anyone, regardless of how long we'd been together, how much I'd invested in the relationship, or what other people might think about my decisions. I have the right to require respect from everyone in my life. I have the right to financial transparency in my marriage. I have the right to express my feelings without being dismissed or criticized. I have the right to maintain friendships and family relationships without someone else's permission. These aren't selfish demands or unrealistic expectations. These are basic human rights that everyone deserves, regardless of age, gender, income, education level, or relationship status. If asserting these rights damages a relationship, then the relationship was already damaged. If requiring respect causes someone to become angry or vindictive, then they weren't actually respectful to begin with. This doesn't mean that healthy relationships don't require compromise, patience, and forgiveness. But compromise should be mutual. Patience shouldn't be unlimited, and forgiveness doesn't require accepting repeated harm. Learning to tell the difference between normal relationship challenges and unacceptable treatment has been one of the most valuable skills I've developed. It's protected me from getting involved in similar situations, and it's helped me build healthier connections with everyone in my life. Now, as I finish telling you this story, I want to make sure I've given you practical information that could help if you or someone you love is in a similar situation. If you're experiencing financial abuse, start documenting everything. Take photos of bank statements, investment accounts, credit card bills, and other financial documents. If you don't have access to these records, you have the right to request them from financial institutions. Consider opening a small savings account in your name only at a different bank, somewhere you can accumulate resources that only you control. If you're experiencing emotional or psychological abuse, start keeping a written record of incidents. Note dates, times, what was said or done, and how it made you feel. This documentation can be crucial for legal proceedings, but it also helps you maintain perspective about patterns of behavior that might be slowly escalating. If you're feeling isolated from friends and family, make an effort to reconnect with at least one person who knew you before the problematic relationship began. This person can help you remember who you were and what you enjoyed, before someone started telling you those things weren't valuable. If you're worried about your safety or the safety of other family members, trust your instincts. Contact domestic violence organizations in your area, even if you're not sure your situation qualifies. These organizations have experience helping people in a wide range of circumstances, and they can help you evaluate your options without pressuring you to make decisions you're not ready for. Most importantly, remember that asking for help isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign of wisdom. None of us should have to navigate complex, dangerous situations completely alone. Professional counselors, lawyers, financial advisors, and domestic violence advocates exist specifically to help people in difficult circumstances. Using their services doesn't make you weak or helpless. It makes you smart. If someone in your life is discouraging you from seeking outside help, if they're telling you that your problems should be kept private or that no one else would understand your situation, pay attention to that. People with good intentions want you to have access to support and resources. People with harmful intentions want to keep you isolated and dependent on them. As I close, I want to return to something I said at the beginning of this video. I asked you to like and subscribe if this story felt familiar, and I want to explain why that's so important to me. When I was living through the worst of this situation, I felt completely alone. I thought I was the only person dealing with these kinds of problems. I thought there was something uniquely wrong with me, that I'd allowed my family to be destroyed by someone I'd trusted completely. The isolation was almost as damaging as the abuse itself. It prevented me from seeking help because I was ashamed of my failure. It kept me trapped, because I couldn't imagine that anyone else would understand or believe my story. But I've learned that these experiences are far more common than people realize. Financial abuse affects millions of older adults every year. Psychological manipulation destroys families across every demographic. The patterns I experienced with Sarah are repeated in countless relationships, often with devastating consequences for victims and their children. By sharing these stories, by creating spaces where people can recognize their experiences and realize they're not alone, we break down the isolation that keeps people trapped. We provide language for experiences that might otherwise seem impossible to explain. We offer hope that change is possible even when situations feel hopeless. Every person who watches this video and recognizes their own story is someone who might find the courage to take action to protect themselves and their loved ones. Every person who shares their own story of recovery helps someone else realize that survival is possible. This is why your engagement with this content matters so much. It's not just about views or subscribers. It's about creating a community of people who understand these experiences and can support each other through the difficult process of healing and recovery. If you've made it through this entire story, you've already demonstrated the kind of patience and attention that recovery requires. You've shown that you're willing to sit with difficult, complex information for the sake of understanding and growth. I hope this story has given you something useful, whether that's validation for your own experiences, insight into someone else's situation, or just a deeper understanding of how complicated and resilient human beings can be. I hope it's reminded you that it's never too late to choose yourself, to protect the people you love, to build the life you actually want, rather than the life someone else expects from you. Most of all, I hope it's convinced you that you deserve to be treated with kindness, respect, and genuine care, and that accepting anything less isn't loyalty or commitment, it's self-betrayal. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of a community that believes healing is possible, and that no one should have to suffer alone. Please like this video if it resonated with you, and subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, recovery, and the incredible capacity human beings have to recreate their lives even after devastating losses. Have you experienced something similar to what I've shared today? Do you know someone who might be living in a situation like the one I described? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Together, we can help each other remember that we all deserve to be treated with respect, and that it's never too late to claim the life we truly want to live. Remember, you are stronger than you know. You have more options than you can see right now, and change is possible at any age. I'm living proof of that truth, and I hope my story brings you hope for your own future, whatever challenges you might be facing. Thank you again for your time, your attention, and your courage in facing difficult truths. Until next time, take care of yourself, and remember that your well-being matters.